you've probably heard the phrase, you are what you eat. I think we're also thinking you are what you breathe in, and that we believe the rich microbial soup that is in nature tops up some of the beneficials that we have. So we breathe in microbes that then colonize our gut and then affect the health of that gut.
Welcome back, my friends, to the Epic Gardening Podcast. This week, we have Dr. Ross Cameron, the research director within the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Sheffield. I'm very excited to have him on. He's the co-author of Environmental Horticulture, the Science and Management of Green Landscapes, and he wrote the Health and Wellbeing chapter in Science and the Garden. Along with that is also a professional horticulturist and advisor to the RHS, or the Royal Horticultural Society, which is something that sounds very fancy. Ross, sounds very fancy. I wish I was in it. Maybe one day I'll join, but I'm excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. It's great to be here. So it's all about gardening. It's all about fun. Never mind the long titles. That's what we're all here for.
Of course. And so today we're talking about, birds by the back door. This is something that we actually recently had Dr. Kaylee Swift on, who is quite experienced in corvids, so crows and such. Mm-hmm. And I've gotten really into both studying the birds in the backyard, but specifically crows I've become, really in love with. But, just generally speaking, in your experience, like what role do they play in the garden?
I think they're the element of life, aren't they? They're obvious physical movement in the garden, and they often attract our attention first. And I think having a bird table and feeders and things like that just brings the whole place to life. I mean, I see it as a very much like a kind of soap opera. You kind of watch the different individuals in the garden and the different roles they play. So I see it as a little bit of a sort of an analogy to our life, but in a much more informal and fun way. Of course, for them, it's serious business. They're fighting to get food all the time.
I know. For us, it's like, oh, look at that cute little bird. And, for them, they're probably, who knows what's going on, if anything is going on mentally, but they are trying to survive.
They're trying to survive. Yeah, and we can help them with that. So we provide the food in some ways, but we also provide the shelter and make sure the place feels secure. And if you're really lucky, they'll nest in the garden and you'll see the young ones too.
So what I've noticed is I have not actively built the garden such that birds would come, but of course that's like the natural consequence of some of the actions I've taken, specifically sort of pruning and shaping some of the existing trees on the landscape. The fruit trees have really boosted the amount of birds that are in there, and then just generally keeping the ground planted and covered to some degree, whether it's with edibles or with ornamentals. It's almost like a beacon is sent out, and life in general responds accordingly and comes to that area.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting because that's where we've actually found things like cardinals prefer urban environments. So if you actually have well planted gardens, you actually get higher populations of some of these birds than you would even in the forest situation. So they know it's a dining place. They know it's a fast food place for them. And that attracts them in. So the more you can kind of give that three-dimensional structure, as you say, ground plants, a few trees, and quite dense bushes, that's the sort of ideal mix for most birds.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed. So in San Diego, where I'm at, there are 3 species of hummingbirds, and I've now used the Merlin Bird app from Cornell to start to log and catalog. And I believe I've attracted all 3. I'm not 100% sure because those are some of the harder ones to ID at a quick glance. But
yeah, they move.
They're fast. But man, I'll tell you, we put a pond in the backyard, pretty large scale pond, and we've planted it out in a relatively natural way, like looks sort of in place. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that at least 10-ish species of birds are coming to that area specifically just to either bathe or drink. And of course, a lot of folks can't put in a pond of that scale. So what would you say the role of water is in the backyard landscape for birds? Yeah,
well, you want some sort of water there, even if that's just a shallow dish. And if you have a pond, you actually want shallow edges, because things like your American robins, if they kind of need to bathe to just keep their feathers in good condition, they don't want to jump in at the deep end. So give them shallow locations, and just make sure in hot weather it's kept topped up, because they will get some moisture from the food, but it's ideal that they can actually drink directly and bathe. So the old-fashioned bird table, or even just a sort of nice ornamental tray. It doesn't always need to be naturally looking. Something that's quite a natural feature, and it just attracts in the wildlife.
Is it true that, edible gardeners, which is a lot of the folks listening to the show, they will complain about, birds eating their tomatoes or their fruits. And my understanding, and hopefully I'm right, but please correct me, is that they are doing that primarily to get the moisture within the fruit. If there's water elsewhere, it may be such that they don't eat your tomatoes as much.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big fleshy fruits like tomatoes are half the attraction to them is they're getting moisture. So if you can find top that up somewhere else, you're less likely. I mean, they're attracted to the color too.
Sure.
So you do probably just want to net the area off if it's just coming to full cropping time sort of thing. But I also tend to like if it's cherry sort of thing. I'll take the best from the tree, but the ones that are sort of slightly misshapen or not quite ripe or whatever, you can put on a table nearby, and then that's where the birds will see them more obviously anyway. So you kind of share and share alike, as it were.
What about feeders? Do you partake at all? I know I had mentioned the hummingbirds and the 3 species, and of course you want to put out like the nectar red feeder of some sort. What I've noticed though is that the hummingbirds have almost completely ignored it, perhaps in favor of just whatever else is out there. I have a ton of these sort of tubular shaped flowers that they seem to be doing just fine on, and they just ignore the feeder.
Yeah, no, if their natural source of food and nectar is there, they'll often use that, prefer it. They have to kind of learn to use the feeder. So once they've got the act, they'll know it's an easy source. But if they don't know it, then it's kind of trial and error. So that their natural place will be the more, the honeysuckles and other long tubular flowers that they're sort of associated in the wild with it.
When I grew up in suburban San Diego, there was a honeysuckle plant next door, which is the tubular red flower, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would eat that. I'd pop that off and flip it and do it. So I can only imagine how attractive it would be for the birds. Is it true that, my understanding is that you can train, or a mammal can become dependent on a feeder in your yard, but birds are much less likely to become sort of like psychologically dependent on the feeder? They will always sort of default to like the natural forage first.
Yeah, I don't think they're dependent on it, but if it's an easy source, they'll actually use it quite frequently. So we tend to put peanuts out in Britain in the sort of cold winters, and that's just such an easier source of calories for them than trying to scrape for old aphids and scale insects and things off the tree bark. So it does depend. They're pretty smart creatures. They know what's easiest for them, and sometimes it'll be what we put out, and sometimes it'll be what nature's providing.
What's wild to me is this is taking us a little far afield of the garden, but I was on an island called Coronado here in San Diego. There's a big bridge you go over to get to it, and there's a very wide beach, so a ton of sand, even at high tide. And there's a lot of these sort of bigger clams, I suppose. They're like, I don't know, maybe like a river rock size. And the gulls there are smart enough to pick them up, and then they know the height at which to fly such that they can then drop it. And it's almost always that the shell breaks open. And then they can pick out the clam from there. And it was crazy to watch it happen, because there was not only the birds that would do the dropping, but there were also like the lazy birds that would just wait for someone else to drop it.
Bit lower down and swoop early. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, well, they're even smarter than the first bird, because they got someone else to do that that far for them. But yeah, it does seem like, I don't know, some sort of like beautiful symphony that goes on in the backyard, which has become, aside from the produce, of course, one of the most rewarding parts about the garden for me is just watching the ecosystem express itself.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the crows earlier. They're one of the bird groups that actually will use tools. So in Britain, we've seen them pick up sticks and try and weasel out, bits of food from things. So that is the sign of what they call sentient life. This whole tool making, and us, the chimps and the crows, are the sort of 3 groups that do it. So they're amazingly adaptive creatures and adapting to the gardens that we're giving them.
Yeah. Any thoughts on specific plants, whether it be a category of plant or even just down to a species level, that one might consider actually cultivating just to get birds in?
Yeah, well, I mean, it varies slightly in the States, but in Britain, I use the rowans, the sorbus species, which are, of course, temperate, bit colder region than where you are. But they're great for bringing in birds all through the winter, because the native species is the one that kind of gets dined on first. So all our thrushes, our redwings and things will come in, and they'll kind of strip them around about September time. But if you use some of the Asiatic sorbus, which have red berries and white berries and yellow berries and things, they're a bit more fussy about them, and they'll take longer. They'll still eat them, but they're a second or third choice. And we often get the migrants coming in later in the winter to pick those ones off, including things like waxwing. So we have these European waxwing, which are a really lovely bird. And if you're really lucky, you'll get a whole flock coming in and eating off these rowan berries. So there are specific plants you can put in just to attract. And you mentioned the hummingbirds, of course. So anything that's got nectar, those long tubular things, the more you pack that into the garden, the more likely you're going to get the hummingbirds as they pass by.
And now turning to the color choices in the garden, both stuff that we choose, but also maybe stuff that just grows and impacts us.
Yeah. So obviously flowers have color, plants have color. We need to question why flowers have a color. So the reason they're there is they're actually attracting the eye of the bee and the butterflies and everything else that will pollinate them. So they provide color that we see, but also colors we don't see, the ultraviolet spectrum as well. So a bee will actually see a petunia in a slightly different way that you and I would do it. But we think it also has an effect on us. We think there's emotional responses to color in the garden, and it's certainly increasing interest in so-called therapeutic gardens that you design with that in mind, and that you provide different emotional experiences on the sort of predominant colors that you design into the landscape. And it's been known since the Victorian era that the kind of the greens, the blues, the purples relax you. They tend to slow the metabolism of you. And so if you're looking for a sort of chill out place, then it's actually lavenders and the greys and the greens, and that's a kind of stops the stimulation. But if you're actually wanting to get the blood pulsing, if you want to improve mood, if you actually induce what's called positive affect, those are the little happiness moments you have during the day. The sort of the team scored a goal or whatever, that little jump for joy. And the colourful plants do that. The hot colours do that for us. So they actually get the blood pulsing, the blood rate goes up a bit, and you have a quiet smile to yourself. And so we're kind of understanding more about the sort of shapes and colours of plants and how they affect mood. And if you're a really clever designer, you can kind of play on people's emotions by putting in a range of different colours.
I've read some studies about this. It was, I believe, in my early university days studying psychology and talking about prisoner experiments, I guess they did, where they would paint the inside of the cells certain colors. Blue, obviously, being a more calming one. I think maybe yellow, perhaps not work, or yellow or red, sort of not being one in that instance that would work so well. And it fascinated me because you want to think that as a person with, hopefully some level of autonomy in life, you can control what you're impacted by, and it doesn't, the environment is something you don't ping off of, and it doesn't like totally control you. But it is kind of interesting how you say that. When I do think of a calming place, in my head, when you said that, I did not think of a single color that was like a bright red or orange or yellow. I thought the lavender, the periwinkle, maybe like a soft green, maybe not super vibrant green, almost like the Spanish lavender, or that sort of misted, frosted green, It's really interesting how that works. And I wonder sometimes, is that a cultural memory thing? Like, I grew up that way and I'm associating to it. Is it possible that another culture or group could be associating in an opposite way? I don't even know what you think about that.
Yeah, I actually think it's a bit of nature and nurture. So we had a PhD student, we have a PhD student called Liu Zhang, and she's looking at flower colour. And what I said earlier is quite true. So about 60-70% of us will kind of feel more relaxed when we're in the blues and the greens, and we'll feel more uplifted when we're in the reds and yellows. But if you grew up as a child who liked red, if red's your favourite colour, that individual can both see it as relaxing and as uplifting. So the people who can actually get both sides of the spectrum are the one that have actually a favourite colour. So once you bring in favourite colour, some of the rules break down. And that, we kind of think that's probably a learned experience. So some of the other things might be kind of part of our genetic makeup. Certain colours do certain things, but you can override that by your personal preference. So if you're into yellow sports cars, you probably like yellow, and it may well relax you as well as stimulate you in
Oh,
the right
that's
way.
interesting. So if you've sort of overruled the biological programming of color
Yeah,
via like your own childhood experience, let's say, I don't know, maybe I was into Hot Wheels, like you said, and I
yeah,
really love, oranges and yellows. Maybe I find solace in something that almost everyone else does not.
yeah, exactly.
Ah, that is fascinating. Okay, well, let's go to that angle then, Ross. Like common plantings someone might include in their landscape for that positive affect, for that uplift in mood.
Yeah, well, I mean, I for the positive buzz, then I tend to go. I actually use a lot of American plants, so
Okay.
that idea of the strong sunlight of the prairie and replicating that in the British context often provides a very strong, positive vibe, particularly around August, September, or late summer. So we're dipping into the helianthuses, the black eye Susans, all these sorts of hemerocallises, all these sorts of quite bright colours at that time of the year, which probably wouldn't fit in a British cold February. There is a link to the sunlight and what you're kind of expecting. But these are magical places. I was in the Botanic Gardens today where we have ones which are nothing like your prairies, but it's still almost 2 meters high, and
You
you're pushing through the yellow daisies, and it's a wonderful experience. So
Yeah.
you've got that, and then I mentioned winter. In winter, you've actually got much more subtle colours, and you're using the pastel shades more often to create that sense of place. So color is the main emotional driver when we're in the garden. It's surprisingly powerful.
Yeah, it's something that I'm almost ashamed of how little I valued it in the early days of my gardening career, and even just environmental design, even look at the inside of a home, painting the wall, right? But in my gardening history, I was really so utilitarian, almost to a detriment, where if I can't eat it, I don't grow it. It's space maximization only. And there's times and places for that. If you're in a balcony garden, what are you really going to do, right? You got to make the best of what you have. But with the benefit of more space this year, I've found not only color but height. And so I have these really large sunflowers, all these different varieties of sunflowers, some
Yeah,
branching.
yeah, yeah.
So they create this sort of weird, almost like a person's hiding in it type of structure. And then some of just the stalked ones. And yeah, it's July. So a nice, tall, beautiful orange or red does sort of give you this energetic feeling when you get out into the garden. You go like, I don't know, there's some sort of qualitative unspoken feeling about when you walk out into the garden and you go, yeah, this is what it's supposed to feel like right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's interesting. You mentioned earlier, you kind of came into gardening through food.
Yeah.
To me, that's what gets me into food. I like the different colours of tomatoes. The fact you get some that are green and yellow stripes and some that are deep plum and the conventional red ones. So my attraction into the food side has kind of come through that aesthetic. So we're all sort of driven by slightly different motivations, but
Yeah.
the variety is part of it.
I think what's so interesting that I found in talking about gardening for I don't know how many years, probably too many years now, is there's about 20 different angles that will get someone in, and it's just choose your own adventure as to which one is
Yeah.
the most attractive to you. So in your case, the aesthetic, the color. Jacques on our team is as a flavor guy. He wants to grow. He does not really care so much about what it looks like, more how it tastes. Myself, it's the scientific sort of how this happens, why this happens is really interesting to me. Obviously, other folks might be beauty. This is fascinating. I've studied a lot lately, Ross, about just the gut brain connection, like that kind of stuff. And obviously, there's some ties to the garden, but I was not aware about the topic of today's conversation at all.
Yeah, well, you've probably heard the phrase, you are what you eat. I think we're also thinking you are what you breathe in, and that we believe that the rich microbial soup that is in nature tops up some of the beneficials that we have. So we breathe in microbes that then colonize our gut and then affect the health of that gut. And by doing so, they kind of helping us in two different elements of our health. So the first one is, as a child, you're challenging your immune system. So you're breathing in from things from the natural world, and you're learning what's good and bad, and your body's building up resistance to the bad ones, and it's kind of utilizing the good ones. And it's worth just saying that 45% of your body is human, the rest is microbial. So you're a walking city. You're not a human with your own decisions. There is discussion to be made about how your body moves forward with your microbial friends. So the first one is it basically builds up our immunity. And the second one is the gut. The microbes in the gut affect the regulation of hormone levels, and hormone levels affect our health, our mental health. So the whole, the adrenaline, the endorphins and things like that, we think are linked between that, as you mentioned, that brain-gut axis. So we call it the atmosphere gut-brain axis. It's three elements coming. And the thing about the plants is that we believe that the closer you get to rich organic soils and the closer you get to natural ecosystems, the more benefits, the more beneficial organisms you're breathing in. So living in a sterile environment could be one of the mechanisms of why we're impacting on our poor health.
That is fascinating to me. I've heard a bit, about the impact of, let's say, playing in the soil, hands in the soil, some of the microbes that can then, of course, access the body from there. I had not, I guess, thought about the quality of the air, right? Both negatively and positively. I guess I'd only thought about it in the negative sense, right? Is there a toxin or a pollutant in the air? Not, is there perhaps some level of microbe or yeast maybe floating around that is actually good to have? Yeah. It reminds me of the phrase or the term hormesis, right? Where a small introduction of something like theoretically harmful actually produces like a stimulatory effect. It sounds like that's kind of what's going on, right?
Yeah, it's training the body's immune system. So if you're not exposed to these things, including pollen, so if you've never experienced pollen as young, and then you may be more prone to hay fever and things later on. So it's just about getting the right kind of dose and mix of doses that the body learns from and adapts. It's not about overdosing it or not giving it that stimulation in the first place.
So how does this tie into something practical myself or those listening might be able to do in the garden? I know we want to talk about some shade plants, some climbing plants. How does that all connect?
Well, we think that the plants are also a source of these beneficial microbes. So the research, which was done by one of my PhD students called Jake Robinson, is that as you move closer to the soil, you get more of the beneficials. So there's a vertical profile, but also as you move closer to a tree or a climber or something that's up at your height, up at where you're breathing, there's also a kind of plume of beneficials around that too. So you can imagine walking through a forest, you've got all these things in this still air around the trees. So those sort of shady or vertical greenery around you seems to help breathe in the beneficials. And one of the reasons why we think kids have probably got a better immune system, so your immune system kind of gets worse when you reach your sort of 20s and things, is we may just be physically further away from where these beneficial top-ups are, where the feeding station is, as it were, because it's around the soil and it's around the plants.
I read a article a while ago about the practice of Japanese forest walking.
Yeah.
And how that was supposed to have a positive effect on the immune response and stress. And I had never I thought maybe it was just the environment itself, maybe the visual stimulus, the audio stimulus would maybe lower cortisol or something like that. It sounds like obviously maybe that's happening, but at the same time, I had never thought about the, I guess the density of microbial life in the air relative to where where your mouth, I guess, is in the air, right?
So the forest bathing, we call it forest bathing in the UK, is exactly analysis, and it's the same process, except you're breathing in specific organic molecules from the plant directly. So it's the essential oils really off the trees that you're breathing in, and they have again two processes. So they regulate hormonal level. You can reduce adrenaline, for example, by a walk in the wood, and they've done studies in Japan where they actually remove the trees and just give you the chemical and you get the same effect. So we know it's a direct biochemical effect. And then you've got this whole idea of inducing immune responses. So what they call killer T cells. So basically the body's defense mechanisms against cancer forming. That again is also induced by these volatile chemicals from the trees.
Let's say I had a dirt lot in my backyard and equate that to maybe the bubble boy sort of way of living, very sterile, no connection, no interaction. And I said, I don't want to live this way anymore. I want to, I suppose, get as close to forest bathing as I can in my own environment. What approach should I start to take there to craft that?
Well, we think that the analogy for microbial richness and even organic molecule richness is very similar to the idea of biodiversity. So if you have a really rich floral meadow, if you have a really dynamic woodland, we think you're probably going to get better microbial action. So it's the whole sort of holistic approach. The more the merrier, the more connections, the more interactions you have in nature is probably relating to a healthier environment. So covering our gardens in plastic or concrete or even a kind of monoculture of grass or something is probably a lot less beneficial than this dynamic mix of what nature's providing it as this cocktail, as I call it.
Would you know of any studies or even have a hypothesis on, obviously certain cultures evolve and grow up in certain areas of the world, right? So if I perhaps was a desert people, I would not perhaps have obviously all of the VOCs that are coming out of the forest.
Yeah.
And so would I be at a strict disadvantage, do you think? Or is it just perhaps that I'm now acclimated to a different set of...
You're acclimated to a different set. So we know when it comes to, we talked about the sort of gut biome. So we know that if you're an indigenous Amazonian Indian, then you will have a much better microbiome. You'll be much richer and more resilient than somebody like you and I, who are used to an urban lifestyle. And if we're just fast food eating all the time, our microbiome's pretty damaged. So again, it's the diet, but it's also the environment. So if you're eating fruit and nuts and vegetables and roots and scrubbing around in the soil, you're much more likely to have a stronger profile.
Are there any plants you think someone could, getting back to practicality, could someone go into a backyard, maybe their backyard, and just put a specific type of plant in the ground that would give them a good head start here?
The smelly ones are the ones to think about. So that whole aromatherapy, essential oils, so your citruses, if you're in a Mediterranean type climate, your citruses, your lavenders, the things that are we've known for a while that, have a bath with that, you kind of feel a bit more soothed. So on the volatiles, those plants definitely. If you're talking about the microbes, I think cultivating the soil, having trees and climbers, vines around you, all will help. So our patio now has plants at the edge of it. So if you just sit out, you're actually only a few inches away from a leaf. So it's about not following the idea slavishly. Still create a garden you want, but just try and get as much dynamism and as much variety in it as possible, I think.
Something to leave us with here, Ross. If you think about, I always say, like, a garden, a vegetable garden, you're sort of picking plants from around the world and combining them. Obviously, they weren't all endemic to the exact same location originally. Say tomatoes versus corn versus sunflowers or something like that. Is there something to be said about it being perhaps unnatural, so to speak, to mix these plants from all different parts of the world? Or would your perspective be the more the better, sort of?
I think in some ways it's yes to both, because if you have a garden, then the more varieties you bring in, they to some extent will catch on and build relationships with any microbes, any other organisms that they kind of depend for their own survival. So we know trees actually have a whole range of mycorrhizal associations around their roots, and they grow better when they have those elements there. So I think if you are picking and choosing across the globe, as it were, you will inevitably bring in some of the things that come with the plant itself.
Sure.
Having said that, if you are strolling through a North American prairie, which has evolved over thousands of years, and it has lots of those links, so the relationships between one plant species and another, and we now know that plants themselves communicate through roots and through fungal relationships. There are also the whole bacteria and viroids and fungi that are in the soil too provide the rich habitat. So that evolutionary process, that pristine environment, really probably is the one that tops up the most beneficial.
Yeah.
But you won't necessarily have a prairie in your back garden, so you've got to start from scratch.
That's sort of what my thinking was, is sure, it'd be nice if you could perfectly replicate the native landscape that once was on the property you happen to live in now, but that's not reality. So basically do the best that you can.
Yeah. And I think just let nature flow. So don't be overly scrupulous about cleaning things and blitzing the weeds. Let some of the wildflowers come in at the edge. I think that whole dynamic process is part of it.
Now going to this idea of restoring or building attention in the garden via what's called a rill. And I think many of us listening don't know what a rill is. So maybe we should start there.
Okay, well, let me just try and deal with attention restoration theory first. So it's interesting that you mentioned gaming on computers. So the whole idea of nature being beneficial for our health comes to what's called kind of the indirect attention. Okay, so when you're on your computer, you're concentrating on which guy's moving around or which car's there, and that's what's called directed attention. Your brain is working really hard to follow the action. And in the average working day, when you know that feeling when you come home, you've got a headache, you know you've been directed attention all day, you've been focusing on the computer, and you've had a lot of concentration. Nature provides a balance to that by directing your brain to things that aren't that important, that don't need intensive concentration. And I see that as a way is that the brain has kind of through the day, it's got tighter and tighter as a spring. And then when you go home at night and you're sitting in the patio or sitting in the garden, that spring slowly releases itself. And you observing the birds or the tomatoes growing or the colourful flowers is what's called soft fascination. And that's one of the elements of this indirect attention. You're actually focusing on something, but not in an intensive way. It's a nice pastoral experience. So the brain is unwinding when you do that. And that's one of the real values of nature, is these little observations you have. And the more you can actually physically move or mentally move yourself away from that gaming station or that piece of work that was annoying you and worrying you, the better the benefit. And an environment that makes sense to you, one you're familiar with, or you understand the natural processes, or the brain is linking into natural shapes, because the brain gets confused by lots of incoordinated messages and shapes. So these are the different elements of what's called the attention restoration theory, which was adopted by or developed by two American psychologists, Rachel and Stephen Kaplan.
So let's dive in a little bit here before we get to the idea of rills. When are you saying that, let's say I'm sitting up at the pond and I notice at 5-something p.m. the hummingbirds like to drink from the pond return, and then I look at I don't know, my fan blowing in the greenhouse and blowing over the plants, and perhaps I see a bird on the tree line. You're sort of saying that unlike maybe a video game or a TV show or a piece of work, I am focused on those things, but I don't care as much as I might doing the other thing. And that somehow is expanding my capacity to pay attention to something.
Yeah, it's restoring the brain's, it's basically resting the brain in a sort of positive way. So it is because it's not important to you. If that was the mathematical problem you've been struggling with all day, you would still be getting stressed about it. It's the fact it's distracting you from that. It's taking you away mentally from the day's pressures that is restorative.
So would this have some level of tie, like we talk about stress a lot in work culture, but then beyond stress, there's this idea of burnout, which is, I don't have a strong personal definition of what burnout really, really means. I think I've experienced it in my time working at Epic and building Epic, but it does seem like it's something beyond stress. And it seems like there's a way to, I suppose, get out of it. But that way, I used to think, well, that way would just be to relax, and relaxing equals watching a TV show. But perhaps that's not really the answer here, because it certainly doesn't seem to have helped. Perhaps you have to do some sort of forest walk or something where you have this soft fascination, like you mentioned, to rehabilitate your brain. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, so let's just explain burnout a bit. So burnout is day after day stress. So your body will only take so much. That spring just gets tighter and tighter till it breaks. And so a lot of mental health, most depression, mild depression particularly, comes from a stressful lifestyle and not being able to cope after a while. So we see these natural environments for moderate mental health issues as fairly beneficial. It won't necessarily help with schizophrenia or some of the more significant mental issues people have. But everyday stress relief is what we're looking for in these environments, that downtime, that relaxation. And the body needs it as well. So probably a TV film, particularly if it's a fast action movie, it's still causing your brain some upset. You're having to focus. If you watched a gardening program or pictures of mountains or something, it might actually be much more restorative. So you are right, and you want to avoid that burnout. It's really interesting you mentioned your business, because the one group of people where the green space normally doesn't help is people who are trying to run a horticultural business.
Yeah, I know.
So they're still looking at the plants, but they're still worrying about the profit margin, or where next week's labor is going to come from, or are the customers going to turn up.
The great irony of, I suppose, anyone who's made a passion into a career is that the career can detract from the passion, right? And so, to your point, I will say I've gotten much better at separating these two distinct activities in the garden. So, after we speak, we'll be doing some filming today, and I'll go out and I'll more mechanically or sort of strategically look at the garden. What can we do today? What's interesting for people to watch? But I will say, and when we get to about sunset or so, and I know we're getting to this idea of a rill here, and I'll tee it up for you. I have the pond, right? And so the pond sounds with the birds and some of the wind and all that, it does make me kind of drop out of the thinking brain a bit and get back in. And I can somehow still access that. Although I will say it's still difficult, because if I see something interesting, I go, oh, well, I should tell people how this works, because this corn is doing this, right? So it is kind of funny, the great irony, I guess, of your passion not giving you the relief it once did in the early days. But that does bring us to this idea of the rill. So what is a rill?
So a rill is a small linear piece of water. So it's usually moving water, and it's associated with desert environments, and particularly the faiths of the Middle East, so Judaism and Islam and early Christianity. So in Islam, for example, it relates to what's called the 4 rivers of life. And these would, even before people became religious, the idea of water in the desert was obviously the lifeline. And you would take a natural spring, or you would have a river, and you would divert water into the productive landscape, into where crops were growing. And there was this little movement of water that literally brought life to you, because you could then have water to drink, but also food to eat. So even in today's garden design, it has a lot of symbolism, this idea of a small stream of water transversing across the landscape. And I think it's very restorative, because you just sit there and you see the movement of the water, especially if there's a ripple effect, and you get that tinkling sound of water moving over stones or glassware or something. So you do see it in the really hot climates, particularly Spain and the Middle East, where Islamic cultures have been, that the gardens always have these straight rills going down, and they're very much a symbolism of water coming out of the Garden of Eden and things like that. So it's a fascinating mix of natural behavior response, natural survival, and then spiritual belief.
Yeah, it's fascinating too. It's like kind of how we talked about yesterday, and bringing plants in and trying to simulate what might be the forest walk, which, or the prairie walk, wherever your local biome is, you don't really have the ability to perfectly replicate that. And similarly here, like, maybe the best someone can do in their backyard is to put in a fountain that streams or something like that. Is that what you would suggest?
Yeah, I mean, in Britain, we probably have a slightly wetter climate than where you are, but we get lots of rain. So what I was really advocating in the book and elsewhere is that you actually have this rill running from a downpipe. So you have a drain pipe, captures the water off the roof, and rather than kind of having an underground pipe that goes to the pond or something, just make a feature of it, have it run across the patio or even the car drive or whatever. And when it rains, you have a little stream, and when it doesn't, it's dry, and it's just a dry gravel bed or something like that. But it just brings that relationship to rain and water and life in a very sort of nice but also practical way, that you can divert water and recapture it in the pond, or in the in a sump tank or something that you can use to water the garden later. So just make a feature of a drain pipe, really.
Yeah, that's smart. I mean, the way we did it at my house is I have a flat roof angled backwards, and then the water captures off into the gutter system, which then filters, and it does go into an underground pipe that drops into a cistern. So that part of the process is unseen. Fortunately, we now have the pond, which I can use the cistern water to top up, and I have this sort of recirculating element. But I think it's a cool idea to have it run overground, so that you do get a bit of that. Now, maybe in my climate, not as applicable, but certainly if you're listening and you have a wetter climate, That's a great idea. Why not build it into the landscape and work with what you have instead of sort of manufacture something to hide it?
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
even in your climate, I think having a dry riverbed planted up, that aesthetic, and then when the
Mm.
rains do come, it actually has a real river, and then it disappears again. So you still have
Yeah.
the planting and the architectural feature, but it's
Yeah.
also functional.
Much like it would in my climate, there are areas where the riverbed's dry
Yeah,
like
yeah,
10 months out of the year, right?
yeah,
And so,
yeah.
yeah, it makes total sense. As we get into berries, yet another curveball, and I'm excited to hear like what should we be knowing about growing and eating these things?
Well, this is your domain. This is food horticulture, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the idea of food part being obviously the fundamental of health is probably the one that most people know about. So in the papers and the books we've written recently, we know that a healthy diet relates to health. I guess we're a bit more surprised about how different foods affect our health. And obviously, the fresher the food, the better. So, again, you're in a great climate where you will get fresh fruit and veg regularly. That isn't the case everywhere. So a lot of stuff is frozen and packaged. So we know that fresh is best, and that's because there's a whole range of chemicals that come in that are beneficial to us in the food we eat. And the red berries and the blackberries are a special group. There are other groups, so the leafy cabbages, etc., have a whole range of other chemicals that are beneficial to us. But the red berries have a particular antioxidant, which is called anthocyanin. And the more intense the colour, the deep raspberries or whatever, the higher the concentrations of these antioxidants. And these are the things that if we regularly eat, we can stave off cancer for longer. These are the cleaning system in the body. And even at a biochemical level, it's quite fascinating what they do. So you've probably come across the term free radicals, which isn't a political movement. It is actually an ionic relationship in your body and your cell. And these guys are trouble because they're basically got full of energy and they don't know what to do with it. So they'll latch onto a vital part of your cell and nick the electrons off it, which then causes the cell a bit of dysfunction. Well, these little good guys from the fruit, from their red berries, they block that ionic reaction. They basically are giving up their electrons to the over hyper tough boys, and they're then protecting our cells. So these are lining our cells in a way to stop the nasty biochemical reactions that can happen. And so things like cranberries, blueberries, raspberries, cherries, all the red stuff, and even things like your tomatoes, but also some of the purple veg, like purple carrots, for example, will be high in anthocyanins. And they think blueberries is the superfruit that probably has the highest concentration. So a regular diet of these provide these antioxidants, but they also provide other minerals and sugars as well. So part of a balanced diet.
What's interesting to me is I think I'm not going to get this perfectly correct, but if you look at the glycemic index of some of these fruits, the ones that are higher in the anthocyanins, like you mentioned, these berries also tend to be on the lower end of the GI or the glycemic index, which means that like not only you're getting all the anthocyanins, etc., but you're also sort of not spiking the blood sugar as much. Now, I'm certainly not a nutritionist, so please don't take what I'm saying, guys, at face value here. But I'm just trying to connect the dots here. And growing them is I wouldn't say easy. I would say it's certainly in my area, it's a little more challenging. These blueberries are quite difficult. The thing I kind of want to hone in on, though, Ross, is I've collected wild blueberries actually in both coasts of the Americas. So in Maine, so the very tip of the Northeast, as well as in Alaska, which would be the very tip of the Northwest, and different flavors, different profiles, but still wild berries. The flavor is incredible. And what I'm curious about is, do you know of any sort of comparison between the store-bought versus, like, what is the decay of fresh to store-bought? What is the differential there?
I think it varies with different fruit and how they're stored and how they're packaged. So I wouldn't want to put people off buying fruit because it still has 90% or whatever it is of the beneficials there. But that impact of immediate flavour off the berry, the bush or the tree, that fulsome flavour probably relates to just a slightly more richer mix of some of these beneficial chemicals. So the longer you store it, you get more breakdown. And that's why freezing and other things they do lose some of the beneficial effect. but I'm not sure. I think it would be different rates of breakdown and different types of fruit and veg, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Is it a good rule of thumb then to say the more colorful the better, specifically when that color is in the red to quote unquote black range, like basically super dark purple?
Yeah, super dark purple is what we're after.
Yeah.
So that tends to be the highest peak of it. But you also mentioned sugars, you know, and the good thing about the fruit is that they provide a matrix of different sugars, so it's not refined sugar. So again, even though you're getting sugar, which is carbohydrate, it's a kind of complementary mix. And it's the same with some of the anthocyanins. You actually want, you know, a varied diet to get some of the different anthocyanins. You're just covering every base by doing that.
Yeah.
But even in a slightly warmer climate, you know, the peppers and the tomatoes and things like that will provide equivalent sort of beneficial groups of stuff. So you don't have to go and crave the cranberries and the blueberries. There will be sort of comparable benefits in some of the other fruit.
Where would you recommend, or actually, I'm curious, do you grow any of these yourself in a home garden?
I look after the cherries, which is a major undertaking.
Nice.
I have to batter the daughter to keep her off them before I get to them. And then my wife tends to look after what we call the sort of the tayberries and the loganberries and the blackberries and things like that in more of the sort of slightly formal allotment area. But I've got a mini orchard of cherries, and I guard them preciously from the birds and from the roving family.
It's fascinating. I'm very blessed to be in a climate where I can grow quote unquote almost anything, but the berry world is a little bit more limited to me. Specifically, like, I've struggled repeatedly with blueberries, blackberries, and raspberries. Specifically the blueberries, and then also cherries. I haven't even ventured into yet. I know it's possible. I think there's maybe one variety. But all the trees that require chill hours, it's just very difficult for me to cultivate. But nevertheless, I mean, I can't complain. I've got citrus, I've got avocados, and things like that. But Ross, it's been fantastic having you on. Fascinating week. We've tied together a lot of different things, and I know you have a new book out. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that right now.
Yeah, well, the research has largely been about health and well-being. And after the pandemic, when everybody really engaged with and valued green space around the home, I wrote this book called How Plants Can Save Your Life, 50 Ways of Sort of Growing. And it was both a way to package up why nature is good for us, and at the same time give new gardeners, particularly new gardeners, I think, little ideas about how they could elicit some of these benefits. So it was a really nice project to do to try and bring 25 years of research to a more pragmatic point, and the book hopefully will give some ideas to people who want to enjoy nature, enjoy gardening more effectively.
I highly recommend you guys to check it out. It'll be in the podcast description for every episode this week. Ross, it's been fantastic having you on. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.